a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such, and yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
It was supposed to be a power move, another declaration of independence from Donald Trump's America First agenda. "We don't need Canada's lumber," Trump said from the rally stage, his supporters cheering, his tone dripping with bravado. It was meant to send a message that America could build, supply, and stand alone. But 3 years later, that declaration has aged like rotten wood, because now the United States is facing a construction crisis, skyrocketing lumber prices, supply shortages, and building delays spreading from the Midwest to the Deep South. And the irony? It all started with Trump's promise to free America from Canadian wood.
Canada does not dump lumber into the United States. And we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified.
This isn't just a story about trade. It's a story about arrogance, economics, and payback. Because while Washington pointed fingers at Ottawa, Canada quietly adapted. And now it's the United States that's paying the price. When Donald Trump first launched his America First trade agenda, one of his favorite targets was Canada. He called our trade deals unfair, our industries subsidized, and our success stolen from American workers. And nowhere was his rhetoric louder than in the lumber dispute. Standing on stage in Michigan in 2020, Trump told his supporters, "We're done being ripped off. We don't need Canada's lumber anymore. We'll cut our own trees." It sounded patriotic, even heroic, to his base. But behind that applause line was a dangerous misunderstanding of how intertwined the U.S. and Canadian economies truly are. For decades, Canada has been America's largest supplier of softwood lumber, feeding the very backbone of U.S. construction: homes, schools, office buildings, furniture, even military barracks. Our forests in British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec supplied nearly 1/3 of the U.S. market. It wasn't charity, it was efficiency. Canada had the resources, the climate, and the infrastructure to produce high-quality timber at scale. But Trump's trade team, led by protectionist advisors who saw every import as an enemy, moved fast. They slapped new tariffs between 20% and 25% on Canadian lumber, arguing that Canada's producers received unfair subsidies and dumped cheap wood into the U.S. market. At first, Trump's move looked like a win. American lumber companies cheered. Politicians called it the rebirth of U.S. timber. News outlets ran headlines declaring a comeback for domestic logging. But beneath that celebration, the math didn't add up. The U.S. simply didn't have the infrastructure or workforce to replace Canada's volume. Lumber production in the American South was already stretched thin, and environmental restrictions limited expansion in the West. The tariffs didn't create new American jobs. They created new American costs.
A little bit more lumber within their supply, but there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from Canada.
By the end of 2021, U.S. builders began to sound the alarm. We can't get enough wood. Prices doubled. Construction timelines collapsed. And while Trump kept boasting about economic independence, the numbers told a different story, a self-inflicted wound in the name of nationalism. That single quote, "We don't need Canada's lumber," may go down as one of the most expensive sentences in modern U.S. trade history. The first warning signs hit quietly. Home builders in the Midwest reported lumber deliveries delayed by weeks. Contractors in Texas and Florida said bids were being canceled because costs had exploded mid-project. Then came the hard data. Lumber prices in the U.S. surged by 23% in just 6 months. Construction firms started folding. Housing developers froze projects mid-build. A single-family home that would have cost $250,000 in 2021 suddenly cost nearly $300,000 by 2023. And the culprit wasn't luxury design or inflation. It was wood. In other words, Trump's tariffs had backfired. By cutting off Canadian supply, the U.S. government assumed domestic lumber production would fill the gap. But the American lumber industry wasn't ready. Many mills had shut down during the 2008 housing crash and never reopened. Others were constrained by labor shortages, environmental restrictions, or outdated technology. The America First dream of self-sufficiency turned into a nightmare of scarcity. And it wasn't just housing. Furniture makers, construction suppliers, and even schools felt the sting. The National Association of Home Builders in Washington warned that every $1,000 increase in construction cost priced 150,000 Americans out of the housing market. Yet despite these numbers, the Trump camp kept celebrating. Advisors blame Canada for holding back supply, while the U.S. lumber lobby quietly pocketed record profits from inflated prices. It was a perfect storm, corporations winning, consumers losing, and political rhetoric masking economic chaos. By 2024, American builders were desperate. Imports from Europe and South America couldn't fill the gap. Pine from Finland, oak from Brazil, even processed timber from China began entering the U.S. market at staggering costs. The irony was painful. The U.S. had replaced affordable Canadian wood with expensive global imports, all in the name of independence. And Canadians? They were watching closely, because while their industry had taken a beating, they knew that America couldn't sustain this lumber war forever. The price of arrogance was now visible in every American home under construction. Half-finished frames, delayed deliveries, and a housing crisis Trump's policies helped ignite.
On lumber, on timber, on wood products, furniture, vanities, and kitchen furniture, etc. The country that was facing the biggest impact.
At first, Trump's tariffs hit like a hammer. Across British Columbia and Alberta, sawmills slowed to a crawl. Shipments that had once rolled south every morning now sat in warehouses collecting dust. Thousands of workers were suddenly facing layoffs, and small timber towns that had depended on cross-border trade for generations found themselves staring into the unknown. Ottawa called the move short-sighted. Carney's government publicly condemned the White House, but privately, the mood was colder, analytical. Instead of matching Trump's anger, Canada decided to play a longer game. Officials inside the Department of Natural Resources quietly met with provincial premiers, not to complain, but to redesign the industry from the ground up. The message from Ottawa was clear. If America doesn't want our lumber, someone else will. And that's exactly what happened. Within months, Canadian exporters began rerouting shipments to Europe, where housing and infrastructure projects were booming. Contracts were signed with South Korea, India, and even Saudi Arabia. British Columbia's coastal mills, once 80% dependent on U.S. buyers, began loading freighters bound for Asia instead of freight trains bound for Seattle. The shift wasn't easy. Some companies went under, others merged to survive. But necessity has a strange way of creating strength. By 2024, Canadian lumber exports to non-U.S. markets had jumped more than 40%, offsetting much of the loss from American tariffs. And there was another twist: value-added production. Instead of exporting raw logs, Canadian firms started refining, laminating, and pre-manufacturing timber domestically, building cross-laminated panels, modular housing frames, and engineered wood products that sold for far higher margins. What started as a defensive move became an industrial upgrade. Meanwhile, Carney's team encouraged provincial governments to invest in automation and sustainability. Marketing? Canadian wood, not as cheap material, but as green gold. Europe, desperate to cut carbon in construction, saw Canadian timber as a perfect fit. By the time the U.S. finally realized its mistake, Canada had already evolved. The old trade model, where Canadian mills depended entirely on U.S. buyers, was gone. The new one was global, resilient, and profitable. Trump's tariffs had backfired spectacularly. Instead of crushing Canada's industry, they forced it to modernize. Instead of creating dependency, they created independence. And the sweetest irony? As American builders begged for cheaper lumber, Canada was too busy filling foreign orders to pick up the phone. Trump thought he was punishing Canada. In reality, he taught it how to live without him. While Trump dominated headlines with fiery speeches and threats, Mark Carney played a very different game, one built on silence, strategy, and timing. Carney knew something that Trump didn't. In trade wars, the loudest player usually loses. He understood the economics of dependence. For every American builder shouting, "Buy American," There were 5 construction companies silently praying Canada wouldn't retaliate.
Their lumber costs, which is a key input into building homes in the U.S. and affect affordability of housing in the U.S. So it's not good news on both sides of the border.
The U.S. couldn't build fast enough, couldn't harvest enough, and couldn't process enough. So Carney waited. Behind closed doors, his economic council prepared what they called Operation Resilience. Instead of retaliating with more tariffs, they fortified Canada's financial position. Subsidies for modernized mills, accelerated export diversification grants, and new trade attachés in Europe and Asia. It was chess, not boxing. And while Trump's administration was busy celebrating victory on cable news, Carney was studying the cracks forming in America's housing market. The warning signs were obvious to him. Lumber prices rising, projects delayed, mortgage rates climbing. He knew those cracks would widen into fractures. By 2025, they did. U.S. lumber shortages were so severe that some construction firms began secretly lobbying Washington to reopen Canadian imports. States like Ohio, Wisconsin, and Texas were seeing home build delays of up to 8 months. Prices for basic framing lumber had nearly doubled. When asked whether he'd push for a new trade deal, Carney's answer was deliberate and understated. Canada will continue to sell to partners who value reliability. It was a diplomatic dagger, polite, factual, and devastating. Trump's America had bet on bluster. Carney's Canada bet on patience, and patience won. Even international observers took note. Bloomberg called Carney the quiet counterweight to Trump's chaos. The Financial Times described Canada's approach as a masterclass in economic endurance. And yet, Carney never gloated. He knew that every short-term victory risked political backlash at home. So he kept his triumph understated, focusing instead on job retraining programs, export insurance, and long-term contracts with foreign buyers. The result? A Canadian economy that not only survived the lumber war, but emerged leaner, smarter, and more respected. Trump's approach was noise and confrontation. Carney's was calculation and control. When one man shouted, the other strategized. When one demanded loyalty, the other built partnerships. And as the numbers rolled in, as U.S. builders paid 30% more for wood that once came cheaply from Ontario, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. Trump's slogan was, "Make America Great Again." Carney's unspoken reply was, "Canada never stopped being smart." Now, in 2025, the truth is unavoidable. America's housing industry is cracking under the weight of its own pride. Walk through a construction site in the U.S. Midwest today, and you'll hear the frustration. Builders saying, "We can't get material," foremen telling clients, "We need to push delivery another 2 months," and families wondering why their dream homes now cost $80,000 more than planned. This is the price of Trump's lumber war, a crisis born from ego, fueled by politics, and paid for by ordinary Americans. Since
35% on lumber going across the line is just ridiculous. There's over 250 small manufacturing family-run companies like us in BC. It's gonna kill thousands of jobs.
it wasn't cutting off Canadian imports, the U.S. has tried to replace supply with domestic logging, but the numbers don't lie. Canada's forestry sector exports nearly 35 billion board feet annually. The U.S. can't come close to matching that. Its forests are more regulated, its mills less efficient, and its workforce smaller. It would take a decade of investment to replace what Trump tore apart in a single policy stroke. And in that gap between political ambition and industrial reality lies the reckoning. American contractors have started lobbying Congress to roll back the tariffs. The National Association of Home Builders is issuing warning after warning. The U.S. can't meet housing demand without Canada. The irony? These are the same voices that cheered Trump's trade war in 2020. Meanwhile, Canada stands stronger than ever. New trade corridors have been forged across the Pacific. Foreign buyers from India to Germany now see Canadian wood as premium material. The country once accused of being too dependent on the U.S. now has leverage in markets worldwide. Inside Washington, officials are quietly acknowledging the mistake. Reports leaked to Reuters show that several states have asked federal trade representatives to negotiate exemptions for Canadian lumber, essentially admitting defeat. And yet, the political damage is already done. Trump's promise of American self-reliance has produced higher prices, slower growth, and a housing affordability crisis that voters can see with their own eyes. For Canadians, it's a strange moment of vindication, but also reflection. Because this isn't just about timber, it's about how nations handle power. One chose arrogance, the other adaptability. One roared for headlines, the other built quietly for the future. And now, as the U.S. rebuilds its bridges, literally and diplomatically, it faces a question it never thought it would have to ask. What happens when your lesser neighbor turns out to be the smarter one? Trump said, "We don't need Canada's lumber." But the markets have answered, yes, you do. Because in the end, you can cut tariffs, you can raise walls, you can shout slogans, but you can't build a house without wood. And right now, the best wood still comes from the north.
If a Canadian builder is to receive subsidies for building in Canada, that they ensure that they are eligible only if they use Canadian products such as Canadian cabinetry.